Good day. Today is Sunday, 29th June 2025, and even as the fighting between Iran and Israel remains in uneasy truce, the fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza has been intensifying. Israeli bombing of Gaza has apparently been escalating. Violence and death in that tormented city and territory continues to spike. And President Trump talks, as he often does, ineffectively, of a ceasefire. Though it's quite unclear to me what kind of ceasefire he has in mind, or what his intended terms are, or what steps he's prepared to take to achieve such a ceasefire. Anyway, he's talking about a ceasefire, and we'll see whether that has any effect at all. In the meantime, it isn't just Gaza that is under attack. There's also apparently been Israeli bombing of Lebanon going on over the last couple of days, renewed violence in Lebanon as well. And one gets the sense that the Middle East remains in an explosive situation, that none of the underlying problems that the various parties have attempted to solve, each in their extraordinarily different ways, have actually brought in any way the situation closer to any sort of conclusion. I remain firmly of the view which I have expressed ever since this current iteration of the crisis began, that violent solutions of the kind that the government of Israel has embraced not only are not going to resolve any of Israel's underlying problems, they're only going to make them in the long term worse. And this quite apart from the moral abyss into which the Israeli leadership, Israel itself, is descending, dragging, it must be said, much of the West down with it. So anyway, let's actually go back, however, to the crisis that is now at center stage in the Middle East, which is the crisis between Israel and Iran, and indeed both between the United States and Iran also. Before I do so, however, let me quickly say that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has now published on Truth Social a ringing defense of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who is facing legal proceedings in Israel, very complicated legal proceedings that I have no intention of discussing in this program. I'm going to say straight away that I think this is most unwise. I think that it is quite wrong for external powers to interfere in the internal and legal affairs of other powers. President Trump himself might perhaps want to remember that there were foreign states involved in some of his own earlier legal problems during the Russiagate scandal, for example, and presumably he wouldn't welcome that and didn't welcome it then, and I don't think it's his place to be interfering in legal processes in Israel. The other thing I have to say, and this is perhaps something which is politically even more important, does he really want to attach himself so closely to Benjamin Netanyahu at this particular time, given the events which are unfolding in Gaza, given the events which are unfolding in Lebanon, given the deepening crisis in Syria, where the situation, by the way, is deteriorating every day, contrary to various reports one gets of stabilization there. And given that Prime Minister Netanyahu gives every impression of having unfinished business with Iran, with every intention to resume the attack on that country at the earliest opportunity. I say that because whatever Donald Trump's previous actions, whatever the motivations behind them were. The very fact that he pressed for a ceasefire when he did last week surely shows that he was worried that the situation was spiraling out of control, and the person who, of course, caused it to spiral out of control through an attack on Iran that was completely unprovoked and contrary to international law, was none other than Prime Minister Netanyahu. It seems to me that he is the last person that Donald Trump, whatever his earlier feelings of friendship or continued feelings of friendship towards Netanyahu might be, he is the last person whom it would be wise for President Trump to attach himself so close to politically. Anyway, never mind. Those are my views. I don't suppose the President of the United States is paying the slightest attention. But there it is. I can still express them. Anyway, what about this crisis between Israel and Iran at the moment? Well, Raphael Graci, the current director of the IAEA, the man who apparently also wants to become UN Secretary General, and who might, for all I know, eventually become UN Secretary General. Anyway, Raphael Graci, entirely oblivious and unheeding of the criticism that has come against him and against his organization from Iran, but also from Russia, and to a growing extent from China too, continues to speak about the importance of his organization returning to Iran and resuming its monitoring and regulation, in which, of course, it completely and abjectly failed. And a number of people, after the comments I made about him and about the IAEA, not just in my last program, but in my previous programs, have also written to remind me that Grossi and the IAEA has made no word of criticism, spoken no word of criticism of Israel's assassination of Iranian scientists, some of whom the IAEA was doubtless in regular contact with. Indeed, as I've discussed in earlier programs, there are apparently suspicions in Iran that the IAEA provided details about these scientists which facilitated the Israeli assassinations of them. Just saying. But anyway, Grossi, apparently oblivious to all of this, continues to demand his organization's access to Iran. And he's made certain comments which will no doubt make the President of the United States, if Donald Trump is even listening, even more unhappy. Because Grossi also now appears to acknowledge that more likely than not, Iran will be able to resume its enrichment program within months rather than years. And he apparently said this. He apparently said that some of Iran's facilities are still standing. They can have, in a matter of months, I would say, a few cascades of centrifuges spinning and producing enriched uranium, or less than that. And so less than a few months. And he went on to say, we don't know where this material, he means the uranium that has been enriched to 60% levels, could be. So some could have been destroyed as part of the attack, but some could have been moved. So there has to be, at some point, a clarification. We need to be in a position to ascertain, to confirm what is there and where it is and what has happened. And he's also given another interview. It's a very hard thing to do, plus we didn't give much notice. And anyway, it seems that Grossi simply doesn't understand, as I said, the criticisms that are being made of him, and still appears to believe that the Iranians somehow owe him information about the nuclear enrichment program so that he can perhaps go ahead and do what he apparently did previously, which is pass on all of that information to Israel and the United States. Anyway, there it is. I cannot imagine the Iranians resuming dealings with the IAEA, certainly not whilst Raphael Graci remains its director, and it's indeed entirely possible that they might never resume contacts with the IAEA at all. Now, there's been a rather interesting article, I believe it was on Unheard, about the actual story. It wasn't on Unheard, it was in a completely different place, the Libertarian Institute, about the effect of the 1981 attack that Israel carried out on the Osirak reactor, nuclear reactor in Iraq. This is, of course, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It was a spectacular operation, very similar in some of its theatrics to the one that Israel carried out against Iran over the last few weeks, though it's worth saying that Iraq was in no position to retaliate against Israel at that time, whereas, of course, Iran did retaliate against Israel, and as we now know, did considerable damage. But anyway, the event in 1981, the attack in 1981 by Israel of the Osirak reactor, being built by France, by the way, in Iraq, created a sensation at the time. I remember it well. There was lots of criticisms at that time of the Israeli government, led at that time by Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The United States joined in those criticisms and supported a resolution critical of Israel at the UN Security Council. That was the United States at a time when the President of the United States was Ronald Reagan, who was a friend and ally of Israel. Just saying. In those days, the United States appeared to have more agency on some questions than it seems to have today, and perhaps a greater understanding of their implications and of their importance. Anyway, one thing that this article by the Libertarian Institute, to be precise by Jeremy R. Hammond, says is that contrary to the prevailing myth, the Israeli attack on the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq did not stop, prevent, or slow down Iraq's nuclear weapons program. At the time of the attack on the reactor, there was no Iraqi nuclear weapons program. In fact, the reactor, like the Iranian nuclear sites that were attacked over the course of the last 2 weeks, was being carefully monitored by the IAEA and was under the same set of safeguards from the IAEA as the Iranian sites, the Iranian nuclear sites which were attacked, also were. The difference is that in 1981, the IAEA acted furiously to the attack on the Osirak reactor, whereas, of course, this time, under Raphael Graci's leadership, the IAEA has stood aside and said nothing, issued no words of condemnation at all. But the key thing is that the attack on the Osirak reactor, and this is not, by the way, a question of opinion, it is a case of thoroughly documented fact. I have researched this at length in the past, and I believe that the Grey Zone has done the same more recently. Anyway, the attack on the Osirak reactor far from causing Saddam Hussein and Iraq to give up on their nuclear weapons program. Iraq at that time had no nuclear weapons program. It caused Saddam Hussein and Iraq to launch their nuclear weapons program. Iraq's nuclear weapons program began with the attack on the Osirak reactor. As I said, this is fully and thoroughly documented fact. And that nuclear weapons program came extremely close to success. At the time of Iraq's defeat in 1991, Iraq was apparently either a year or perhaps 2 years away from acquiring a workable nuclear weapon. So, what is the reason for thinking that this time it is going to be any different? Iran has been accused of seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, though the IAEA and the US intelligence community have repeatedly said otherwise. Its nuclear facilities have nonetheless been attacked exactly the same way as Iraq's were, despite the fact that they were under IAEA safeguards, as Iraq's nuclear reactor also was. Why assume that Iran will react any differently than Saddam Hussein's Iraq did in 1981? Is it not at least possible that Iran will respond in exactly the same way as Iraq did in 1981 by pressing forward with the nuclear weapons program? Now, I say that Iran is a profoundly different society. The political system in Iran is completely different from the dictatorship that Saddam Hussein, the personal dictatorship that Saddam Hussein had in Iraq in 1981. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was the sole decision maker. In Iran today, the political system is much more complex and far more diffused. So, it's possible that the Iranians might still take a different course. But as I argued, as I said in my programme yesterday, it's all very well for me in London to say that Iran's best interests would be served by developing closer relations with the Eurasian powers, with China and Russia, and deepening security cooperation with them, than by going nuclear. But I am not the decision maker in Iran. The Iranian leadership is, and they, after what has happened, could very, very easily come to a completely different view. Anyway, I wanted to bring back that piece of history because it's perhaps an important one to make. And by the way, the concern that the Israeli attack on the Osirak reactor might provoke Iran into acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, as this article in the Libertarian Institute confirms, was one that worried the United States exceedingly back in 1981. Today, one doesn't get the sense that anybody's thinking or worrying about this possibility at all, even as Raphael Graci tells us that Iran might indeed be in a position to resume its nuclear enrichment program and take it conceivably to entirely new dimensions within a matter of a few months. Now, there's also been some further information about the attack, the original Israeli attack, from Israel itself, and in particular from the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, who is a close ally, political ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, when the attack began, Alex Christopher and I did a program on the Duran, a live stream, in which we said that this was clearly not so much an attempt to disrupt Iran's nuclear enrichment program as to carry out a regime change operation in Iran, and that the method used was that of a decapitation strike, an attempt to murder as many as possible of Iran's political and military leaders so as to create a crisis within Iran, leading ultimately to regime collapse. Well, interestingly, no less a person than Israel Katz, Israel's defense minister, is confirming that very thing. He has given an interview for Channel 13 television in Israel, in which he has confirmed that, contrary to various claims made by people like Donald Trump, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, was an intended target of the Israelis right from the start of the attack. The problem was that the Israelis lost track of him. They didn't know where he was. As soon as the attack began, he was immediately shifted by the Iranian security services to a secret location. The Israelis have never discovered where that location is. They assume it is a bunker somewhere. They're probably right about that. But they don't know his whereabouts, despite Donald Trump's claims, repeated claims, that the United States does and did. These are some of the words that Israel Katz has given over the course of this interview. If he, that is to say Khamenei, had been in our sights, we would have taken him out. We searched a lot for Khamenei, but the operational opportunity never arose. So that was perhaps the single most important target that Israel set itself when it launched its attack on the late evening of Thursday, 12th June. But it was never achieved because Israel lost track of where Khamenei was. So the result is that he is still alive. In fact, Katz goes on to say it. He says that Israel didn't know the location of all of Iran's enriched uranium, and that it did not go into the war knowing that the United States would join the attack. Whilst Israel had marked the Iranian leader for death, Israel was unable to locate him once he hid in a bunker. Khamenei understood this, went very deep underground, broke off contact with the commanders, so in the end it wasn't realistic. And Katz also says that the Israelis, as I said, weren't absolutely sure that the Americans would join the operation, but it seems that they thought they would, and they always expected that if Israel got into trouble, the United States would come through. Note also the admission that the Israelis also do not know the location of Iran's enriched uranium. Israel didn't know the location of all of Iran's enriched uranium. They didn't know, and it seems that they don't know now. I'm not even convinced the enriched uranium was ever, in fact, Israel's primary target. It seems to me that the primary target was none other than the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, or that is how I read Katz's interview. Katz to say. By the way, he also says that Israel didn't seek and wouldn't have sought permission from the United States to assassinate Khamenei. If they'd been able to find out where he was, they would have attacked him, and if they'd been able to kill him, they would have done so without any regard or concern for what the United States itself thought about the matter. And Katz goes further. He says quite clearly that Khamenei is still in Israel's sights. If the Israelis have the opportunity, they will still try to assassinate him. He says that though there's now a ceasefire, the situation, because there's a ceasefire, the situation now is different. But then he pointedly reminded some of his interviewers about the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, who also was assassinated after he resurfaced during a period of a ceasefire. And Katz goes on to say, I wouldn't recommend that Khamenei stays tranquil. He should learn from the late Nasrallah, who sat for a long time deep in the bunker. I recommend that he do the same thing. So, the Israelis have Khamenei in their sights. They sought to kill him when they launched their attack on Iran. They still intend to kill him now. It astonishes me that Israel is so brazen in its statements that it aims to assassinate the leader of another country. The defense minister of Israel is able to give interviews to this effect to the Israeli media and governments around the world, Western governments in particular. The United States government have nothing to say, and the Western media are entirely silent about it. Anyway, I mean, as I said, it leaves me horrified. I won't pretend that I'm shocked or surprised, but I don't think we should overlook what an extraordinary crossing of a red line this straightforwardly is. In my opinion, Western governments made fairly transparent attempts during the operation against Iraq in 2003 and against Libya in 2011 to murder the leaders, to assassinate the leaders of Iraq and Libya, Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. I personally believe that there is significant evidence that the British at least had some role in the eventual murder of Gaddafi, though I cannot prove it, and I do not insist on the claim, about which I have only inferential, if you like, information. But the point is that no Western government came out straightforwardly and said that they were seeking to murder the leaders of Iraq and Libya. The Israelis have no such inhibitions. They're able to say quite openly, quite straightforwardly, that the leader of Iran, a much bigger, far more powerful country than Iraq and Libya, and also a major religious leader with millions of followers, is someone that Israel has attempted to kill and is still seeking eventually to kill. Now, there's an awful lot more that can be said about this affair, this whole crisis. I want to return to one particular topic because I noticed that there's been a major effort over the last couple of weeks to create dissensions and problems between Russia and Iran and between Russia and China over this conflict. I don't believe that there is any actual point of contention between any of these countries, but there's been a particular claim, one that's been pushed very hard, that the Iranian air defenses, which failed, were essentially Russian air defenses, and there's been comments about the fact that the Israeli aircraft were able to bypass and conduct attacks in the face of the presence of Russian S-400 air defense missiles in Iran. Now, let me stress, I am not in Iran. I am not familiar with the workings of the Iranian air defense system. But this whole argument comes up against a fundamental problem, which is that the Iranians and the Russians have repeatedly and consistently denied since the autumn of 2024 that Russian S-400 missiles were delivered to Iran. Now, I say that back in August 2024, there were reports which appeared in the US media, in the New York Times from recollection, that Russia was indeed delivering S-400 air defense systems to Iran. I discussed the fact extensively then. However, those deliveries were never officially confirmed by either government. There were reports that some officials of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran had confirmed the deliveries, but there was no confirmation of that from any Iranian source. Those claims, so far as I know, appeared exclusively in the US media, and instead we got public denials from Iran that S-400 missiles had been delivered from Russia to Iran. Now, I remember discussing these denials, and the one that I recalled in particular was one made on the 17th of November 2024, or reported on the 17th of November 2024. And you can find details of it in an Iranian magazine, Iran International. And the title of the article is "Iran Dismisses Need for Russia's S-400, Touts Domestic Missile Strength." And the article that goes on to say, Iran has not requested Russia's S-400 air defense system, an IRGC official said Sunday, emphasizing the superior capabilities of Iran's domestically developed air defense systems. Our current systems offer far superior capabilities compared to the S-400, said Dawood Sheikhian, Deputy for Operations of the IRGC Aerospace Force, in a video interview shared by the state-controlled media. He added that Iran is also actively using the Russian-made S-300 system and sees no need for the S-400. So we had that public denial from a senior IRGC official, and I remember that there were other denials at the same time. The Russians, around the same time, started to deny claims that they delivered the S-400 system to Iran also. And there was an interesting discussion about this in Putin's recent meeting with foreign news agencies in the Kremlin, which took place about a week ago. And it was a conversation which took place, as I remember, between Putin and a representative of the Agence France Presse. And the journalist from Agence France Presse pushed Putin very hard about how Russia would react if the Israelis were to assassinate Khamenei. And Putin said that it was not a subject that he even wanted to discuss. And then the journalists from Agence France-Presse asked about the kind of military help that Iran can potentially receive from Russia, and specifically asked about deliveries of air defense missiles. And the representative of Agence France-Presse said that Iran had received S-300 and modified S-200 systems from Russia. The S-200 is a much earlier system that dates from the 1960s, but which the Russians have subsequently updated. And Putin replied, yes, we have supplied these systems, but only in individual batches. We offered at some undisclosed time to the Iranians a much more advanced program whereby we would work with the Iranians to develop an integrated air defense system, covering the whole of Iran, not have individual batches of missiles doing separate things. But the Iranians showed no interest, and the proposal in the end lapsed. Now you can find that whole discussion if you want. You can search the Kremlin website, but it's there. And I would suggest that this actually accords very closely with what this Iranian official Dawood Sheikhian said in November 2014. Iran rejected Russian offers of a sophisticated air defense system, not just individual batches of missiles, the 3 or 4 batteries, but the creation of an entire air defense system, because Iran preferred to rely on the systems it had developed itself. I think this was a serious mistake, but there it is. Anyway, there we go. I think that, as I said, one should not be led too far astray by these claims about, which are clearly intended to make trouble between the Russians and the Iranians, and by the way, between the Russians and the Chinese, and all of these 3 countries with each other. There's clearly some kind of an operation, in my opinion, underway. Perhaps, despite these denials, S-400s were delivered to Iran. I've seen no evidence of it. Certainly I've seen no footage of it. At least I'm not aware of any. If there is, perhaps people can provide it to me. From what I can see, there were no S-400s in Iran. And the attack that took place, the Israeli attack that took place, did not overcome this system because it almost certainly wasn't there. Anyway, let's move on to other topics, and let's now return to the other issue of the conflict in Ukraine. Now, last night, the Russians conducted what was not perhaps their most powerful missile and drone strike against Ukraine, but perhaps the one that was widest, broadest in extent. It's a very, very complex operation. Russian attacks on Ukraine now, air attacks on Ukraine, have become incredibly complex and very sophisticated. And this involved apparently up to 500 Geran drones operating across Ukrainian airspace from one end of Ukraine to another. Some say up to 40 different missiles. KH-101s launched by Tupolev F-95 strategic bombers perhaps formed the largest proportion of the missiles used, but ground-launched Iskander-M missiles were also used, as were Kinzhal hypersonic missiles launched from MiG-31 fighter jets operating in Russian airspace. And in addition to those, apparently Kalibra missiles from were launched by the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which, by the way, as we see, remains active. And this was an attack conducted right across the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainians, again, are claiming that they were largely successful in shooting down most of the drones and that they shot down a significant number of the missiles, though this time they acknowledged that none of the Kinzhals were shot down. 4 of them apparently were used, according to the Ukrainians, and only 1 out of 7 Iskander-M ballistic missiles were shot down. Again, I'm going to say straightforwardly, I don't credit these claims. It seems to me that there's very little evidence, again, of any successful, of many successful air interceptions by the Ukrainian air defense system at all. Many of the attacks took place in western Ukraine, and here in western Ukraine, the Ukrainians use, in substitution for their Patriot and other air defense missiles, F-16 fighter jets, which try to shoot down the drones and the missiles whilst they're in the sky. Now, over the course of last night's operation, one of the F-16s was lost. The Ukrainians don't tell us how. They imply that it was an accident, though again, I'm not quite sure how that might have come about. It seems to me that it is at least equally plausible that the F-16 was shot down. The Russians have very long-range missiles from some of their fighter jets, the R-37M to be precise. These missiles can be launched by the MiG-31s, which also launch the Kinzhals, and they can be launched also by Sukhoi 35s and by the new Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighter jets, which have been extremely active, increasingly active in the Ukrainian theatre, and of which, by the way, the Ukrainians don't seem to have managed to shoot down a single one, at least not so far. So, an F-16 shot down, well, it's only one of about 20, 25 maybe. There are reports that Ukraine has lost several others. It seems the pilot of the F-16 that was shot down or lost yesterday was killed. Again, it's difficult to see that the F-16 is performing effectively in the Ukrainian skies, and it is clearly, as Ukraine's own air defense spokesman Yuri Ignat admitted, no match for the Russian fighter jets. So anyway, missile drone strike across Ukraine. The Russians are claiming that the major target this time was Ukraine's drone production facilities. It's likely several other targets were attacked as well. The Russians have recently also, incidentally, attacked training bases where Ukrainian troops are being trained. Some of these training bases have been absolutely smashed. Large numbers of men have been killed. Ukrainian troops in training have been killed in these bases, and immense damage has been done. The Russians, meanwhile, continue their ground offensive across Ukraine, and we're getting more reports again about how that is playing out. There's reports that the Russians are now have now firmly entered southern Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, that they're attacking the industrial sector of that particular town. It's widely acknowledged that if the industrial center of Volchansk is captured, Volchansk itself will fall. There's reports that the Ukrainians are trying some kind of counterattack in Chasov Yar reminds me very much of the counterattacks that the Ukrainians carried out a few weeks ago in Toretsk nearby, which proved completely unsuccessful. There's also further reports of Ukrainian troops being cut off in parts of Chasov Yar and south of Konstantinovka as well, and as the Russians gaining more ground around Konstantinovka altogether. And there are lots of reports of significant Russian advances in western Donbass, in the area that faces the Dnieper River, and reports that the Battle of Novopavlivka, the major fortified town in Dnipropetrovsk region, which is used as a logistics center by the Ukrainian army, that battle and the storming of that town is likely to begin very soon. But the big story appears to be Pakovsk. And here there's been many reports now of significant Russian advances, indeed a breakthrough by the Russians northeast of Pakovsk, that the Russians have in fact advanced towards a town called Dobrolюбово, which is located north of Pakovsk, some distance north of Pakovsk, even as the Russians also are now pushing through southwestern Pakovsk, apparently working to complete the capture of the village of Udachne, and with the objective of advancing north towards another village called Sergeyevka, which is located to the northwest of Pakovsk. If these two operations are successfully completed by the Russians, which in time, of course, they will be, then any Ukrainian troops in Pakovsk itself will be taken into a cauldron. Now, the Russians have now also confirmed that there is indeed fighting going on in the southern suburbs of Pakovsk. And this information comes from Igor Kimakovsky, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government, which is, of course, the Russian-backed regional government of Donetsk. He says, he's reported by TASS as saying, our troops have advanced south of Krasnoarmeysk, that's Pakrovsk, and launched an assault on the southern suburbs. Fighting is currently taking place in the area of the village of Belkika, and the Ukrainians are bringing new groups of drone operators to this sector of the front. And incidentally, there are reports that here again, Ukraine is short of infantry, and this is why it is again having to rely excessively on drones to withstand the Russian advances. My own view is that the Battle of Pakovsk has begun. In fact, it began perhaps a week ago. There were reports, I remember, that the Russians had entered Novoekonomichne, the big village which is essentially an eastern suburb of Pakrovsk. There are more reports that the Russians have started to cut off the various roads into Pakrovsk. It seems to me that there is now an intensifying battle, and I'm going to guess that for the remainder of the next few weeks, it will be the battle for Pakrovsk that will be the major battle taking place in the area of the special military operation, though the Russians also continue their pressure elsewhere, most specifically on Konstantinovka as well. Now, to repeat what I said in my various programs, the Russians have hardened their positions. They are now making it clear that in the diplomacy they no longer support. In fact, they've now started to oppose Ukraine's entry into the EU. And the Russians show no sign or readiness to soften their positions on any of the other questions relating to Ukraine, Ukraine's NATO membership, the reduction in its armed forces, recognition of the four regions as Russian, restoration of the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, legal protections of the rights of Russian speakers and of the use of the Russian language in Ukraine, all those various things. I see no sign that the Russians are prepared to soften their positions at all. And yesterday, a Russian MP, member of the Duma, Mikhail Sheremet, actually went further and said that the situation for Ukraine is now becoming catastrophic on the battlefronts, that Zelensky's government has lost control of the situation on the battlefronts, and that Ukraine, the Ukrainian leadership, is now in a state of early collapse, that the situation is no longer viable and that the situation could lead to collapse. The Kiev regime, due to its chaotic multi-vector approach and lack of unified command, is losing control of the front. This inevitably leads to disastrous disorganization and panic. We're witnessing a catastrophic chain reaction, beginning with the loss of battlefield control in this senseless war and escalating into growing civil conflict within the collapsing country of Ukraine. And he then went on to say, and this is all according to TASS, that he believes that Zelensky's regime is now on the verge of collapse, and that this presents Ukraine with an opportunity to return to a peaceful path of development. I think he is probably right, though a bit ahead in terms of his assessment of the military situation. But I see no sign myself that the government in Ukraine, Zelensky's government, is in any way losing political control of the country. On the contrary, I think its grip is as firm as ever, probably more so than it was this time last year, around the time when General Zaluzhny, the former Ukrainian military chief, had been forced to resign. So that's my own assessment. I think that Sheremet might be, as I said, a bit ahead on the military side of things, but he's completely wrong on the political side. But the fact that he's talking in this way, again, shows the extent of Russian confidence. But it's the mood in the West that I want to talk about briefly. Firstly, it seems to me that in the United States, Donald Trump now talks about everything or anything except Ukraine. If you go to Truth Social, apart from his flamboyant defense of Prime Minister Netanyahu, he is busy speaking about domestic matters, the passage of his big, beautiful bill through the Senate, those sort of things. He no longer really wants to talk about or think about Ukraine to the extent that he is focused on any foreign policy issue at the present time. It is the crisis in the Middle East, and he is apparently now floating the possibility of a trip to China, which, by the way, would probably be a good thing, but he doesn't seem to be interested in talking about Ukraine anymore. And the situation in Europe, however, is different, but there it's taking a really extraordinary turn. I am, of course, British, and I am based in Britain. And the most interesting thing that has happened in Britain over the last week is the complete implosion of the authority of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. He is apparently the most unpopular Prime Minister since polling records were made. His negative ratings are equal to those of Gordon Brown, the new Labour Prime Minister, at the tail end of the Blair-Brown government. But of course the difference is that Brown was never elected Prime Minister. He never won a general election. Whereas it's barely a year ago since Keir Starmer won a massive majority, seemingly making him the dominant political figure in Britain and the most powerful Prime Minister since Tony Blair. But support for him has completely dissipated. He is now openly mocked within the political class, by the political class, and within sections of the media as never here care. In other words, the Prime Minister who spends most of his time abroad dealing with foreign policy issues and shows complete uninterest on actual government of the country itself. His attempts to reform the welfare system have provoked a massive rebellion amongst Labour MPs in the House of Commons. Starmer made all kinds of derisive comments about the rebels initially. He then threatened to strip them of the whip, which would have effectively expelled them from the Parliamentary Labour Party. The problem was there were too many of them doing that, and had he done it, he'd have jeopardised his own majority. So over the last couple of days, he's made a whole succession of concessions to them, and the latest reports suggest that the bill is going to be so watered down as to be basically gutted, with the welfare system being left pretty much as it was before any of these reforms were proposed. And, well, that's all bad enough in the sense that it essentially leaves the Labour government without a fiscal policy or an economic policy. Not that it ever had much of one in the first place, but it also shows Starmer no longer in control of events, no longer able to control his own parliamentary party, whose members had been carefully selected basically to support him. And all of that calls into question whether he's really in power any longer, whether he just occupies the Prime Minister's office and performs the rituals of the Prime Minister without actually being able to make any of the practical decisions. In which case, given how important the Prime Minister is institutionally to the whole operation of the British government, Britain, to all intents and purposes, is left with no Prime Minister at all. In the United States, it might be possible for Joe Biden to carry on performing the rituals of president and having all the actual functions carried out by a shadowy, unelected group of unnamed advisors. It might, in theory, be possible to do that in the United States, though not without the political system there suffering significant damage. But the British system is different. It is much more manual. It does not work on automatic pilot for any stretch of time. It requires the Prime Minister to be structurally engaged because theoretically He is only the king's first minister. He is only the first amongst equals in the cabinet. If he doesn't exert his control constantly, then the cabinet is likely to go its own way, with various ministers doing whatever they choose and paying no attention to what the Prime Minister says, with the result that the government rapidly loses any degree of coherence and everything starts to grind to a stop. So I suspect we are quite close to that point now. And I would also say that if we do get to that point, then it seems to me unlikely that Starmer can remain Prime Minister for very long. Now, there is a myth in Britain that the Labour Party never moves against its leaders, that anybody who becomes Labour leader is basically secure, and a Labour Prime Minister can never be ousted, and that there is no precedent for that within the history of the Labour Party. Now, that used to be true until relatively recently, but it is not true any longer. And the key event was the one that took place in 2006, when the Labour Prime Minister, who was none other than Tony Blair, found that his authority within the Labour Party and the government was collapsing. He had discredited himself by his support of George W. Bush 3 years earlier in the war in Iraq. His reputation had suffered immense damage because of the failure to find any WMD in Iraq. He was in conflict with his Chancellor, Gordon Brown, and several members of the cabinet. And interestingly enough, in connection with another crisis in the Middle East, the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, in which Blair took strongly Israel's side. His support within the Labour Party collapsed. There was a rebellion against him by junior ministers, and after a few weeks he was forced to resign. So it's no longer true. It is no longer the case that a Labour Prime Minister cannot be ousted by his own party. It was done before, and even at his weakest, it's important to say that Tony Blair occupied a far stronger position in British politics and within the Labour Party than Keir Starmer has ever done. I said a few weeks ago on a programme we did on the Duran that I personally thought that Starmer's position was becoming so weak that he might not be able to remain Prime Minister for very much longer, and recent events have tended to reinforce that view. In my opinion, the only thing that is currently keeping Starmer in post is that there is no obvious person within the Labour Party to take his place. The two alternative candidates that are sometimes talked about, the Blairite Wes Streeting, who is the Education Minister, and the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, do not seem to me to be particularly strong or convincing candidates. But the current situation cannot continue as it is for much longer if, as some believe, the Labour Party, the government, is pushed into raising taxes in the autumn. I can very easily see how what is left of Starmer's authority could collapse, in which case he might finally be told to go. If any of that happens, no one should expect any changes at all in British policy. Support for Ukraine will remain the same as always. It would take a very strong leader in Britain, somebody with the kind of authority that Margaret Thatcher and indeed Tony Blair once had, to carry out a real shift in British policy on this issue. And whoever replaces Starmer is likely to be, at least initially, in an even weaker position than he is. What we're seeing is an unravelling of the political system, of the political class in Britain, and the collapse in authority and coherence of the Labour government, and it is happening at record speed. Now, I would just quickly say that Starmer's position, in my opinion, has never been particularly strong. One of the reasons why this rebellion has been as wide and as extensive as it has been is because many Labour parliamentarians are well aware that Labour only won last year's election with a small proportion of the vote, 33%, on a very low turnout, 58%, and that they hold their seats on wafer-thin margins. And that makes them very sensitive to currents of opinion within Britain. So that also works against any strong Prime Minister emerging out of this crisis in Britain. We're going to see a long period of chaos and drift with no good outcome ahead of it. Now, if things in Britain look bad, in my opinion, in Germany currently, they look still worse. Here, it seems to me that the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, his personality is starting to emerge very clearly since he became Chancellor. Not only is he somebody who says one thing on economic and policy, that he will defend the debt rate, for example, and then promptly does another. He does away with the debt rate. It's rather that he was presented to the German people for many years as the man who would finally break with Merkel's immobilism, who would lead Germany out of its state of torpor and stagnation, who would return dynamism to the German economy, and who would energize Germany again and restore stability to the country and a sense of direction, and indeed a sense of direction to Europe. That was the root of his appeal, together with the claim that he would bring the CDU, his party, back towards its right-wing origins by returning to this style of politics formerly associated with Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, the leaders of the CDU in its glory days in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, the more we see of Merz, the more clear it is to me that his interests are not really in the economics of Germany at all. So far, he has done very little to change anything substantive in Germany. He's entered into a coalition with the SPD, which, by the way, appears to be in the process of splitting. We'll come to that in a moment. He's done very little to carry out any fundamental changes in the way in which the German economy works, or the whole direction of German economic policy. In fact, the processes of deindustrialization in Germany are accelerating, and Germany is now currently running an ever wider, greater budget deficit, in contravention, as I understand it, of what remains of its original laws. There's none of the great reforms and changes and dynamism and energy that we were promised that Merz would bring. Instead, he seems to be fixated on foreign policy to exactly the same extent that Keir Starmer is, but in an even more idiosyncratic way. He seems to be mostly focused on the process of German rearmament, in which vast sums of money are being devoted to rearm Germany, all of them off budget through this relaxation in the debt brake that I previously talked about. He's now making some extraordinary statements. He's giving the impression that he wants to transform German society to return its former martial vigor, to militarize the German economy, to remilitarize German society, to make young people want to serve in the military once again. He's even been floating increasingly the idea of reintroducing conscription, something which young Germans aren't keen on at all. And I've seen reports that he said some really quite extraordinary things. According to one report which I've seen, and I want to stress here, I have not seen his exact words, but apparently he said that there are a lot of people in Germany who still fear war with Russia, the effect of a war with Russia. He, Merz, isn't afraid of that at all, apparently. That is what I understand that he said. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this was a mischievous mistranslation of something he did say, or maybe it's been invented by his critics, but it does seem very close to the impression that he's giving. Anyway, he apparently is not afraid of war with Russia, and he's a little surprised and baffled that so many other people in Germany apparently are. He's not afraid of war with a country that defeated Germany conclusively in the Second World War, and which is today the world's biggest nuclear power, with the biggest, most powerful and most experienced armed forces in the European continent. If he's not afraid of war with Russia, then frankly he's living in fantasy land, a very, very dangerous fantasy land. And there was another report which I have to say made my eyebrows rise even further. Again, this was apparently said in private, and one must be especially careful here, because it could also be that these words have been misreported or maliciously misreported, which is not impossible. Merz has lots of critics within his own party as well, but supposedly he told his party that one of the main purposes of the CDU is, and of Germany now, apparently, is to continue to support Israel, and he's previously spoken of Israel doing Germany's and Europe's dirty work by attacking Iran. Now, again, if he really did say that, and again, it would be very much in conformity with things that he has actually publicly said, then it strikes me as an extremely strange statement for the Chancellor of Germany to make, because it suggests to me that he places higher priority on support for another country, a country other than his own, when, of course, his overriding priority should be Germany its best interests and the welfare of its people. Now, of course, he might argue that you can reconcile the two by saying that Israel's interests and Germany's interests are so completely aligned that unqualified support for Israel is in Germany's national interests. I have to say, if that is what Merz does indeed think, then it reinforces my belief that this man is unfit to be Chancellor. No country should ever subordinate itself in that way to the interests of another. But anyway, that's certain things that Merz has said. Other things he has also been doing, which also strike me as being bizarre to say the least. He's apparently, again, doing everything he possibly can to make it impossible for the Nord Stream pipelines to be reopened. His attempt to get a provision to this effect in the EU's 18th sanctions package has not been realised because the EU has, for completely different reasons, so far proved unable to agree to an 18th sanctions package against Russia. But Merz, according to the Financial Times, has been lobbying the EU Commission, telling them that in the trade negotiations between the EU and the United States, the EU should specifically prioritise protection for Germany's car industry. It should be seeking from Donald Trump carve-outs on behalf of Germany's car industry. And that should be its first and primary focus. The EU Commission has apparently pushed back and told him that this is completely delusional. There is no possibility that this can succeed because for Donald Trump, the main reason why he has imposed tariffs against the EU at all is because he is unhappy with the extent of German car exports to the United States. Apparently, Merz is unwilling to accept this, and there have been rows and misunderstandings and all kinds of problems, which, again, make no sense to me. Now, Merz has had some meetings now and conversations with Trump, as have other German officials. Other German officials have also spoken to other American officials. If Merz wants to advocate on behalf of the German car industry to the Americans, then it seems to me the best person to do that is Merz himself. Hiding behind the Commission to do it seems to me most bizarre and will reinforce, if it is successful, the already widespread view in Europe that the Commission is there to do what Berlin tells it. A stance that has made the Commission, to put it mildly, unpopular with many of the EU states. But regardless, on this issue, it seems obvious to me that the Commission is right. And of course, on the question of Nord Stream 2, who exactly is it that Merz is pushing back against by preventing Nord Stream 2 from being reopened? German industry? The German car industry, which he's seeking to protect in other ways? Surely the best benefit for them is cheaper energy supplied by Russian pipeline gas. None of it makes much sense to me. Anyway, it seems to me that Germany is currently landed with a crotchety and cantankerous chancellor who is unable to get his biases out of his system. He is unable to see through to German national interests clearly, and he is shaping German policy entirely around a visceral anti-Russian attitudes that are not shared by wider German society, precisely because they are so obviously contrary to Germany's national interests. So, two big European states, Britain and Germany, are extremely badly led. It's not clear to me that Britain is being led at all, and Germany comes across to me as being led by a man who is evolving into some kind of anti-Russian, or rather not evolving, who is being revealed increasingly as some kind of ideological fanatic. It doesn't look very good, to put it mildly. Now, there is pushback in Germany in a way that there isn't yet in Britain. Some members of the CDU are unhappy with aspects of the policy, and the SPD, Merz's coalition partner, is showing signs of being about to split. There is now increasing criticism of the SPD's anti-Russian policy. I read in the media in Britain how it is the old guard of the SPD, the people who supported Ostpolitik, Willy Brandt's policy of Ostpolitik, rapprochement with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, first in the 1960s and then thereafter, who are now resurfacing. The fact that one of the major critics of the current policy from within the SPD is Peter Brandt, the son of the former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who initiated Ostpolitik, appears to be the main ground why people are talking about the old guard resurfacing itself. Supposedly younger leaders within the SPD take a harder Russian line. I'm surprised that the SPD has any younger leaders, or indeed younger supporters. As far as I could see, they've all left and gone to support either Die Linke or the AfD. Just saying. But anyway, I don't believe that to be the case either, for what it's worth. I think that now that the SPD is no longer the leading party in government, now that there is no longer the imperative of supporting the SPD Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, now that in the recent election the SPD is finally facing a real possibility of its own extinction, with its support having fallen to 15%, there is finally a chance that some of the more sane voices within the party are going to begin to reassert themselves and are going to push back on the disastrous policies of the last 3.5 years. At least that is what I hope. But whilst Merz remains in control, obviously there is not going to be a change. If these splits within the SPD and these criticisms of Merz within the CDU lead to anything, it could be that Merz's reign will also prove to be rather short. If so, then I certainly hope so. Because the last thing Europe and Germany need at the present time is another eccentric, fanatical German Chancellor who is driving Germany at accelerating speed over the cliff. Anyway, this is where I finish today's programme. More from me later tomorrow. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star and by going to our shop. Please remember that at our shop we have various items now that are specific to various cities. You might be able to find one which relates to your specific city. And in the meantime, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.